Interesting looking. It is. There goes the lion. I'm done. Yes. All right. A lot of screen real estate to work with here. So, I guess I didn't realize how tiny the screen would be. But I wrote this like in 10 minutes when I got here. Let's see if I can. Can you do full screen in Chrome?
Over the upper right corner there.
Oh yeah. How do you get out of full screen?
You put your mouse up on the top and then that thing will come down. There's actually an even fuller screen.
Is there?
If you hit Command-Shift-F.
There we go. That's not too bad.
That's presentation.
I'm gonna get rid of this. No, don't. Oh, I shouldn't have touched it. So anyway, giving just a really quick talk on promises and some deferred libraries that implement promises. So we've been dealing with problems with promises quite a lot lately at my job. Eric used to be a coworker of mine until he quit. Screw you, Eric. And me and Taylor have been debugging a lot of promise problems. And it kind of comes down to some promise anti-patterns that we've been implementing over the past year and a half. So I started to look more into the different promise libraries out there. That's kind of what led down this path. But to start off, promises basically there's a proposal out there by another one of my ex-coworkers who came up with basically a different pattern of, I guess you could call it a design pattern, right? So instead of pub sub, you'd be using promises and their associated async callbacks and things like that. It kind of, you can use it a lot of different ways, but so promises basically are a way of sharing kind of data async. So let me go back up here to this. So anyway, I used to work with Dojo a lot, which is why Will made fun of me already about Dojo. So I did write up a quick example using Dojo's Deferred implementation. So the deferred object generally has a promise inside of it, and then whatever implementation you're using of the promise API kind of wraps around that. And so Dojo does the same thing. If you take a look at the deferred that's created, there's a bunch of functions around it, statuses, and then the promise itself is hidden in here. So let me make that a lot smaller. So basically, there are different states that a deferred can be in. Pending, resolved, or rejected, I believe. I'm trying to remember if there's anything else. I think if there's an error, it's rejected as well. And once a promise is resolved or rejected, that's it for that promise. It's never changing its state again. You have to create a new promise if you want to, have some other process happen. And it'll bring me to a point later, but about JQuery's implementation, which I'm kind of wondering if they talk about that in their book there, because there are some issues with that. I have a strong dislike for JQuery. So basically, in Dojo, they have a cancel function on the deferred. And if you run that, it hits a different callback. So that callback is right up here when you create the deferred. Where is it? I gotta scroll down on. So that's the cancel. Yeah, I have a hard time reading the tiny. Here we go. So right up here, when you create the deferred, basically the callback to the Dojo deferred object is the cancellation callback. If you don't cancel, this is really hokey, like the way I'm doing this, but it was the fastest way I could think of coming up with something. If you don't cancel, that hits the .then function, and inside .then there is the first callback is for when a deferred is resolved successfully. And then I think there's an error callback, and then there's an update callback. Update callback, I don't think I got working. But basically, it just shows kind of the overall scheme to use deferreds. It's a combination of async and callbacks. I know there was a lot of hate on callbacks a little while back in terms of kind of, a design pattern. No, don't do that. Oh, and I'm coming to the wrong thing. Where is it? It's this right here. So that actually should be working. Yeah, it doesn't. So that should trigger that third update callback right here. It is not though, so never mind. Sorry, so this is just Dojo's implementation of it. There's a new spec out called A+. So it promises A+, which is kind of like the next step. A lot of the newer libraries implement this spec, and it goes through, like the order of the states, what state they can be in, the specs for the then method, which is pretty important, how it behaves. So JQuery does not abide by the A spec or the A+ spec, and they kind of decided to do whatever they wanted. So I put a little fiddle that just really, on the very surface, shows kind of how it behaves just on one thing that they do wrong. And that is the .then function. Let's see if I can.
Do they say why they don't comply with the standard?
So I was reading earlier. This is one of the things we've been bumping into. We used JQuery as part of our job, along with Backbone and CoffeeScript, which I also hate. And
and that's why I'm brain damaged now and only write CoffeeScript.
yeah, it does make it harder to write JavaScript though, once you've been working with CoffeeScript for a while. So we were running into a lot of problems with working with the Web Audio API, and a lot of asynchronous things are happening. And I, way back in the day when we wrote it first, I started using deferreds, and we're using JQuery. So I'm like, I'm just going to use JQuery deferred, and I didn't read the API or the documentation that closely, and made some assumptions about how it behaves, thinking that it behaved like every other deferred promise-based library that I've used. It does not. So the big one is that the .then function should return a new promise once the original promise is resolved. It does not. It returns a promise that is basically a copy of the original promise. So like I said before, a promise can only have one change in state. It either goes from pending to resolved or rejected. For whatever reason, I don't know why, jQuery copies that original promise and then it just copies the state of it. So it's a new promise object, but it has the exact same state as the one that has been resolved or rejected based off of what was being fired on .then. So that can really screw with you if you're expecting a new promise out of that .then function, which is what the spec calls for. So let me run this. In jQuery, there's a .always, which gets called no matter what happens to the deferred. So oops, I covered the wrong one. Reject. Right, so this will get called if it's resolved or rejected. Like if I just went like this and changed to resolve, same thing. So that gets called no matter what. If you bring back the dot then is only called if it's resolved. Right? And so, yes. JQuery is everywhere, and I have a feeling that the most used deferred library is probably JQuery's implementation of it, which is a problem. It's also huge.
Shouldn't it always just trigger as well?
That's what I was wondering too, but it looks like the .then steals it somehow.
Yeah.
And I was expecting it to print out both of them, but it does not.
Does it call it first though? Because we're resetting the interaction.
Oh, okay.
Oh, true.
Good point.
Yeah, it could be. I can log it and see. You want to see? I didn't even think about that.
I want to see.
Well, and then is actually just a shortcut for, was it done in, the first function?
Yes.
When it's bad.
Yeah, then is a shortcut as well. Yeah, Taylor's right.
Which, going back to your, how it's different from everybody else, is because it's a shortcut for those two, you can't chain serial async operations with it. You have to create a new deferred in your function scope.
You are correct. It's just overriding it, so it should be printing out, but I was just lazy. Yeah, so basically what Taylor did on a fix we had today that was like nearly production critical fix, he figured out by looking at the documentation that it doesn't return a new promise, and so we had to manually create a new promise, and when the .then fires, basically return, that deferred promise object back, because that's what we were expecting in the rest of the code base.
Can you explain a little more about why you want to do that? Why would the expectation normally be that the .then returns a promise?
To chain, basically.
So, a good thing in the web client side, things that are async, what we're doing right now is a lot of web audio API. Most of those calls are asynchronous, so we do things like decode this MP3 and then play it back. The decode is async, the playback is async. So if you had a .then, you'd say, decode this, when it's done, then I want you to play it, right? With the JQuery implementation, if you did a .then, when your decode would fire off, you can't chain anything past your audio playback. So let's say you wanted something to happen in the UI after it finishes playing.
Yeah.
You'd have to create a new deferred that's in scope, and then resolve it inside there, and have your then hang off of that deferred that's inside.
Yeah, typically when you chain them together, you're using the next promise for that next level
So they
of
do all these
chaining.
things in order.
Yeah, it's kind of like an async.
Does anyone know if Angular has the same issue with multiple events, or they implement it the same way or differently?
I'm not sure.
Angular is fine. It's more like the Q library.
Okay.
I know you're right, I said they use Q.
They're all dollar Q. It's not the actual Q library.
Yeah, one of the popular alternatives to jQuery is the Q library, the letter Q, or QKEW, which is like a minimized version of it. Anyway, so the last point I was going to make is down here, I'm logging out the promise that was returned from the deferred .then. So according to the promises A and A+ spec, this should just be a pending promise. But as you see here in the log, it's resolved already because it's copied, the original deferred, which ultimately is a problem if you're not expecting that to happen. Any other questions? My rant is over.
Thank you.
I'm Chris, by the way. I don't even know if I said my name. I used to work with Eric, but he quit.
Thanks for coming, everyone. Go buy some O'Reilly books.